Welcome in to Daily Faceoff Live, your go-to source for everything hockey. Live every weekday at noon Eastern.
Welcome in. It's a Thursday, January 19th edition of Daily Faceoff Live. Tyler Yaremchuk and former NHLer Colby Cohen with you. And Colby, you are on Frank Saravalli babysitting duty this week in the Windy City. He's in town.
Oh, we're always pleasure to have Frank out here in Chicago. We had a nice dinner together last night. Of course, Frank showed up about 25 minutes late because, he's working the phones and doing all his radio hits.
Yeah, it's deadline season, and it's absolutely crazy. We'll have some trade deadline talk coming up in a little bit, but let's start by focusing with what happened on the ice last night. So let's throw 2 minutes and 30 seconds up on that clock and dig into Mr. 500, Steven Stamkos, becoming the third active player right now in the 500 goal club, the 47th player all time to hit that mark as well. And when you look at the career of Steven Stamkos, Colby, this is a guy who is, all he does is score goals. And it felt like for a couple years, maybe he was losing that touch a little bit, but he is right back. A 40-goal season last year, hits the 500 mark this year. When you look at this career, is he a first ballot slam dunk Hall of Famer for you?
Absolutely. It's not even a question to me. I think, between wearing on his jersey, keeping that whole team together, not always the easiest when you have a team full of star players like they have there in Tampa Bay. I think that he's a big part of that and the heartbeat of that team. And look, Tyler, I don't think in the history of this game we see that many players that can score like Steven Stamkos. I mean, he could have a sleepy night for 55 minutes, but all he needs is one or two to leave a huge impact on the game. And I just don't think those pure goal scorers like Steven Stamkos come around all that often.
Yeah, you're bang on with that. When you look at sort of this generation of NHLers, I mentioned he's the third active one with Crosby and obviously Ovechkin being the other two right now. But when you think of goal scorers in this generation, it's Ovi and it's Stamkos. This is a guy who hit the 60 goal mark. And I mentioned, injuries and things like that slowed him down for a couple of seasons. And, his goal totals weren't that high, even if his goals per game stayed high. And I remember chatting with him last year in Chicago at the media tour, and he was talking about how motivated he was heading into last year to show that, hey, I still have it because I want to be an Olympian. And when you look at his resume, it really is a shame that that's the one thing missing. He's got the rings, he's got the personal awards, he's got the goals, but he just never got that Olympic gold. I feel for the guy a little bit because it's remarkable to see how long he's remained a top goal scorer in the NHL.
But he also doesn't seem to be slowing down, so there's really no reason to think that his production is going to tail off. He's a guy who takes care of himself off the ice. He's always in good shape. He's come back from big-time injuries, and he's come back strong. And again, when you know how a player's trying to score a goal and you still cannot stop him, like the way he lines up for a one-timer, like the way Ovi lines up for a one-timer, you have a whole team talking about how they're going to kill against you. And I just think that's a special thing, and it's a special label, and I think he deserves all the accolades, and I absolutely think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer.
14th season of his career, and he is once again on pace or close to it to hit that 40 goal mark. Steven Stamkos, a remarkable career, hits 500 last night, and they beat the Vancouver Canucks, which a lot of teams have been beating the Vancouver Canucks as of late. And what a weird situation this has been. I mean, it's been hard not to talk about the Canucks pretty much every show, but for the last week now, we've been hearing multiple reports that, yeah, they were talking to Rick Tocchet. Okay, they may have hired Rick Tocchet, some people are saying. I saw a report from Sportsnet Radio in Vancouver that's like, yeah, no, they might introduce him on Monday. Well, they still have like 2 more games to play. And I just look at this, Colby, and I go, mercy for our guy, Bruce Boudreau. Like, this is not a first-time head coach who's just happy to be getting the look for a little bit. This is a guy that this front office hired last season. And yet you don't have the decency to say, you know what, Bruce, we have a new guy coming in. It's going to take a couple weeks to get sorted out, but we're letting you go. We'll let an assistant take over. I just think it's wildly embarrassing for the Canucks that they're forcing this guy to keep going out behind the bench if they do indeed already have his replacement hired.
Well, you guys love having me on here when there's anything juicy to talk about with the Vancouver Canucks. And I just couldn't agree more with you, Tyler. I think that it's a total mess, the situation that they've created. The fact that, we're getting all these reports and there's leaks coming out of the organization about this, it's really just a bad look for hockey in general, especially in a big Canadian market when you have a fan base that is passionate as the Vancouver Canucks. And, you look at the history, maybe not the recent history, but the not so far recent history. A Stanley Cup Finals in 2011. You've got, the Sedin twins that brought nothing but class and grace to that organization for a long time. And, you've got the guys on TNT making a joke last night when Rick Tocchet was working on the whiteboard and they were like, don't do it too well, Talk, because we want to make sure you're with us starting next week. So like they're even making subtle jokes about it on TNT's panel, which look, those guys like to chop it up and have fun, right, Tyler?
Yeah, it's wild. And I guess I want to pick the player side of your brain a little bit because I think about the guys in that Canucks room. Like they read the press clippings, they know what's going on there. Have you ever been in a situation where your head coach is kind of a bit of a dead man walking and everyone in the room is like, boy, when is this finally going to happen?
I actually was in the American League my rookie season when I got traded from Colorado. I had spent some time in the NHL. I get traded to Boston. I'm back in Providence. Our head coach is a guy by the name of Rob Murray, who was like kind of a tough guy in the American League. Well, our assistant coach at the time was Bruce Cassidy, and we all knew that was going to be Bruce's job any day. And we literally had moments where we were coming in wondering who is going to be sitting in the coach's office, because this is before Twitter was like huge, right? Like everything wasn't being broken on Twitter in the moment. So we would come in some days wondering, is Murr still going to be our coach, or is it going to be Butchie's show? So it's an uncomfortable situation. And if it does play out this way over the next week or two, Tyler, shame on the organization for letting it go down this way.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more, Colby. You talk about Twitter breaking news. Our insider friends like Frank Saravalli haven't really had any trades to break so far this season, and it is a little bit odd to be creeping towards the end of January and creeping close to the deadline with really not a single major move having been made yet on the trade front. And it's brought up the idea of, the cap system kind of really putting a strangle on trades and on transactions. I mean, we've had quality players like Jacob Vrana and Alex Nedeljkovic pass through waivers. Vrana's a guy who could very easily score a team 30 goals, and no one wanted to touch him for free because of the salary cap problems that come with picking up a guy like that. And it's brought up the idea of, is the hard cap maybe the best thing for the NHL, and should they look at a soft cap situation to open up more transactions? But I know that can be a little bit complicated, but it really is a shame, Colby, that we're sitting here, as guys that talk about this sport for a living. We've been doing it now for 4 months, 5 months into this season, and no big trades yet. Like that's the kind of stuff that keeps fans engaged. That brings you to the front of ESPN and the headlines when big moves get made, and the NHL's just been sitting here because every GM has their hands tied.
And there's a lot of big names that could be on the move if the cap wasn't such a problem, that it is, if we weren't living in this COVID cap crunch world that we are. But I think we have to address this because I think there are a number of teams. I bet you more than half the owners in the NHL would be willing to spend more. And I think if you create a luxury tax system, I think you're going to just create a system where you can actually do more for the teams that don't want to spend more, because the luxury tax money can go into the revenue share. It can go to the teams that don't want to spend, that aren't struggling. I don't believe the parity thing. Look at baseball. I mean, the Yankees don't win the World Series every year. The Mets, they're going to have a $500 million payroll this year. Are they going to win the World Series? I'm not betting on them to win the World Series. I think there's enough parity in hockey. There's enough good players. I think having some sort of a luxury tax where you can spend over, or I go back to something I said on this show last month, and I think there's got to be some sort of system for general managers where they are given cap relief for signing drafted players, and let the smart people come up with the ins and outs of the rules, but give these GMs an opportunity to save 10, 15, or even 20% on their cap when they commit to long-term to homegrown drafted players. And then if you think about, let's say you have three guys, like let's say Toronto, you've got Matthews, you've got Marner, you've got Nylander, all guys you drafted. You have 20% savings off of all those players. That adds up to a lot of cap room. And so I think that something needs to be done, because you're right. Everybody is frozen right now, and there are a lot of names and teams that are looking to improve.
We have a little bit of extra time here, so I'll give you my pie in the sky idea. And it's once the calendar flips in the middle of the season, every GM is given a trade credit, whether it's 3 million, 4 million, 5 million. They get an extra little lump sum of the cap that they're allowed to go over as long as it's used for a trade. So you can't use it to go bring a guy off LTIR or anything like that. But once the calendar would have flipped at January 1, 2023, every GM can use $3 to $5 million to bring in a player via trade. This would benefit everyone, in my opinion, from the player's perspective. In the summer, you would suddenly have GMs who go, I don't need to save this extra couple $1,000,000 here for when I get to the trade deadline. I'm going to go out and spend it on free agents right now. So more teams would be incentivized to spend to the cap. For the fans, they'd get more transactions, because January 1 would almost be like a second trade deadline in a way, because teams would suddenly have $3 to $5 million to go spend on a player they want to trade for. And for the teams who are not looking to spend that money and they're sellers, well, hey, you just opened up a whole boatload of teams who will suddenly be more willing to spend more assets earlier, and you'd create more bidding wars. I feel like that would be the way I want to go, even if it's a little unrealistic.
No, I like it. And I think there's no reason creative, smart people can't get around the table and come up with a situation here that works for everybody. Dig in on the CBA. The league is healthy. The TV money is healthy. Teams are healthy. Buildings are healthy. So let's see that, and let's make the game better and more exciting.
Speaking of quality players available at the deadline, that ties in nicely to our deadline countdown for today. A new story up every single day on dailyfaceoff.com. And Colby, I want to talk a little bit about Timo Meier. Frank earlier this week listed the New York Rangers as a team who could be potentially looking at this guy. And I mean, every cup contender should. He's got 26 goals in 46 games this season. That's a 46 goal pace. He had 35 last year. And I know that $10 million qualifying offer is a little frightening to look at, but for this season, he's a $6 million cap hit, which means if the Sharks are willing to retain half of it, man, there should be a lot of teams lining up. But the Rangers as a potential fit, does that make sense to you?
It does make a lot of sense to me. And they've talked a lot about Patrick Kane, and we've heard those rumors as well. But, to me, you're getting a 26-year-old who's a 30-goal scorer, even if he sleepwalks through the rest of the season, which I can't imagine he's going to. He's a winger. There's a need on the wing in New York. They're trying to figure it out with Lafreniere up on that top line. It's been okay. It hasn't been terrible, but it hasn't been great. You see Capo Caco starting to play a little bit. And again, I thought that you bring Timo Meier in, aside from bringing in an elite winger, you're slotting other players back down your lineup that make a lot more sense. And the Rangers last year had that with guys like Kopp, and they had it with guys like Mott. They brought in more good depth type of players. I'm not calling Andrew Kopp just a depth player, but you understand what I'm saying here. Yeah. So I think the Rangers would be a really good fit for Timo Meier. They're obviously going to have some work to do to make that whole situation work. I also like what the Rangers have in their system. They've got a guy like Zach Jones, who's playing in Hartford. He's a good young defenseman that I believe is NHL caliber. They've got some draft picks. They have some capital and some assets that they could move on from. Now, there's another team in a big city on the other coast that I think would be a good fit for Timo Meier, and that's the LA Kings. And I look at the LA Kings forward set, and I think, you bring in Timo Meier, you put him on your first line, you put him on your second line. That pushes Quentin Byfield down the lineup a little bit into more favorable matchups. That takes Alex Iafallo, pushes him down the lineup into more favorable matchups. Those are both guys who play on the left wing. And I think if you in LA can find a way to fit Timo Meier into your system, you become one of the best top 9 forward bases in the entire NHL. So I think those would be two good fits. And I don't know where you stand on the matter, but for me, those are the two.
Yeah, I'm going to stay in the Pacific Division as well. And I'm going to say the Calgary Flames. And I know we got a comment on the YouTube stream right now saying, the Rangers can't afford them long term. I mean, the Kings would have a tough time affording them long term. So would the Calgary Flames. Would. Exactly. Like that $10 million qualifying offer makes it more or less impossible to give to the guy. But for right now, in the moment, teams will be looking at him as potentially a pure rental. And I think that's what'll keep the Rangers. I love that Kings pick as well, because you're right. Their forward group looks good right now. If you added a piece like that, it would hit a whole nother level. And for
Great.
the Flames, I wouldn't be surprised if Brad Treliving sitting there going, boy, I might be in a little bit of trouble if after the offseason I had, we missed the playoffs. Push even more chips into the middle and go get a guy like Timo Meier to add to that forward group and help with the scoring punch. So a bunch of interesting fits. He's a guy who, like you said, he's going to sleepwalk his way to 30-plus goals again this season. And that big body in the playoffs, I think it'd be a perfect fit for anyone who's looking to contend for a Stanley Cup this season. A lot of those teams are in the Eastern Conference, and we're going to get into the math behind that with our friend Cam Charron in the Number Crunch. Cam Charron and the Number Crunch brought to you by our friends at Montana's. Cam, welcome back to the show. I teased it off the jump there. The Eastern Conference looks loaded this year. Is there really a huge gap between the number of cup contenders out East compared to out West?
Well, I don't know specifically about cup contenders, but it certainly seems that way. And this is just something I have been noticing over the last few weeks or so. Whenever I was putting together any sort of model, trying to figure out which teams were the best in the league, it always comes back to league standings. And the teams at the top of the standings, you're looking at, of course, Boston, Carolina, New Jersey. Tampa Bay is ahead of Toronto in points percentage now. So, but those 5 teams are all, of course, playing in the Eastern Conference. And I was curious as to whether this is a kind of a one-off thing or very common. And right now in interconference games, so the Eastern Conference against the Western Conference, the Eastern Conference is playing at a 100 points per 82 pace. So that's like a high level playoff team. Meanwhile, the Western Conference against the East is only playing at an 81 points per 82 pace. So that's below 500. That's below real 500, not just NHL 500. And the last time that we've seen a disparity that big was actually in the 2009-2010 season, when it was the West that was a much better conference. Obviously, they had Chicago and Detroit in that time, and Vancouver. So it's really fun to see that the balance of power has really flipped, and there's some teams that are in the Western Conference that just can't get it going because they can't win games against the East. So Winnipeg are 21-7-1 against the West in their own conference. They're playing tonight in Toronto. They're only 8-8 against the East. That's really cut into their status as a contender because they seem like a pretty good team otherwise. The LA Kings too. They're 17-6-4 against the West, but they're only 8-9-2 against the East. Meanwhile, there are some teams out in the East that are doing okay against their own conference, but they just haven't beaten up on the other opponents that they've been able to, or that their competition has been able to beat up on. And I think of teams like Florida and Ottawa that I think probably should be a lot closer to the playoffs than they are. So that's something that I've been noticing, and something that's interesting, and keep tracks on it for the end of the year to see if the disparity matches. Tampa Bay and New Jersey are 2 teams that have definitely crushed the West so far this year. New Jersey 13-2-1, Tampa Bay 14-4, both of them playing at President's Trophy pace, west of the Mississippi, and kind of middling in their own conference, but doing fine, and they're contenders.
Cam, it's a perfect way to segue into my question for you. We saw the Colorado Avalanche here in Chicago last week, and I caught up with Joe Sakic after the game just to sort of pick his brain a little bit, and there was really no panic there. I think Joe Sakic's probably been through it all. So I'm wondering, this is a team that lost to the Chicago Blackhawks about 10 days ago and has since started to play better. They've had some pretty big responses. They've put up some pretty big scores. Should we expect to see the Colorado Avalanche be an elite team in the second half of the season?
I think it's like every single time, like every game, I feel like this is the game that Colorado really breaks out, and they've just been kind of hanging around in that wild card position. They've never been too far out of the race. It's really interesting. They've had such a strange season because of all the injuries they've had. Now they're getting everyone healthy. You're right. They've had these 3 big wins. They had a very convincing win against Calgary last night. They had convincing wins against Ottawa and Detroit, and they've they've been hanging around so closely, and the West there aren't too many contending teams out West that it feels like it could be 2 weeks where Colorado just breaks out and has a big run and goes on it. So the problem I have with them, and this is something that I noticed about them the last couple seasons, is we talk a lot about score effects in hockey and how teams that are trailing tend to take more shots and teams that are leading tend to hang back a little. Well, when Colorado was probably at their best last year and the season before, they were kind of going against that. When they'd be ahead by 2 or 3 goals against a bad team, they would keep pushing and pushing and try and make that a 3 or a 4 goal lead. And they haven't really been doing that this year, which is a big. It's kind of taken away from the dominance of Colorado, and that's not just a pure injury thing, or I think that it's also a bit of a mentality thing. And I think that the team, they're probably a little bit more okay with sitting back on what they have. They did win that cup. It can take a lot of pressure off you as an organization, kind of a less desire to really push and push. But I just look at last night. I thought they played really well against Calgary, watched some of that game. But in the third period of that game, they were out attempted 18-8 by the Flames, kind of let Calgary hang around, not necessarily let them back into the game. They played really well defensively, but they didn't really push and they took that early 3-0 lead, and they didn't score anything until the empty netter. So they're a really good team at 5-on-5. The special teams are holding them back. They were really strong for them last year. So it feels like any time something could click for Colorado, I'm waiting for them to really take it. Maybe this is when it's finally going to change with now they have Nichushkin back in the lineup.
Great stuff as always, Cam. The Number Crunch is brought to you by Montana's, and they have a brand new comfort food menu out now. It just came out on Tuesday, and look at some of this stuff. Pot roast soup, Chipotle firecracker burger, creamy mac and cheese. It all looks fantastic. Find out more by visiting them at montanas.ca. Cam, we'll chat again next week, man. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm going to go get some apple crisp.
There you go. Moving along to our daily face-off inbox question. You can send yours in with the hashtag AskDFO, and we did get one sent in as well, talking about some GM work from around the league. Colby, we have a little bit over half a season in the rear view mirror now, so let's look back at some work that the general managers did over the summer. Who do you think is the most underrated GM in terms of what they were able to do with their roster over the last 6 months?
Look, I think Ron Francis deserves a lot of credit for some of these smaller moves that he's made that have really paid off in a big way. And, I kind of start with when they drafted Matty Beniers, and then he stayed in school for that extra year, and they gave him a little bit of extra time because he's come into the NHL and he's become a star player right away. So I give him a little bit of credit for that. Not easy to be patient with those top couple of draft picks in the NHL. And then I kind of go down the list of moves that he's made. He brought back Dave Haxtell. Very easily could have moved on from him, but you got to give this organization a chance to set in. They picked up Tolvanen off of waivers. That has provided a nice little spark of offense into their lineup. He got the Jared McCann deal done at a pretty favorable number. I think the cap hit is somewhere between $5 and $5.5 million a season for the next 5 years. This is a guy who is scoring goals this season and looks like a pretty pure scorer. You look at the way that they've loaded up on draft picks. They got 3 second-round picks in the draft this season. This is a very loaded draft. I've been told there's a lot of value late in the first round into the second round. It also gives you the opportunity to move up if you feel strong about something. And then I look at the fact that he signed Ryan Donato for less than his qualifying offer, right? So he saves them $800,000 on the cap. So again, little things that he has done to me when you compound and you start stacking them, nothing that's going to maybe jump off the table and go, oh, wow. But when you put 5 or 6 little things together, that equals a big thing. This team seems to be humming along. I think that they are well coached right now. I love the fact that Jay Leach is still there as an assistant coach. I think he's incredibly bright. I think they did a nice job assembling that staff, and they seem to be really settling into their identity there in Seattle. I watched them absolutely beat up on the Chicago Blackhawks the other night, and you could see that this is a team that plans to stick around here and still be good in the second half of the season.
I love that answer. I think you're right. Maybe not a big home run move like a flashy UFA signing, but that guy just racked up a whole bunch of really solid singles, and we're seeing
And
the
I left
benefits of it right now.
and I left 5 or 6 things out. I mean, I have a list here, like you said, of about 15 singles that he has hit.
I love it. Yeah, for me, I'll go a bit of a different direction. I'm going to say Kevin Cheveldayoff out in Winnipeg. I think this summer, a lot of the conversation was like, hey, the Jets should blow it up. Wheeler, boom, he's expected to be gone. And then you had Scheifele, a lot of talk about his future. There were people saying, hey, maybe you just trade Connor Hellebuck and really start from the bottom. Cheveldayoff didn't do that. He believed in the core he put together, and it's paying off because that team is sitting near the top of the Western Conference right now. It's been an incredible season for Rick Bowness and the Winnipeg Jets. The only problem, the only beef I have with them is they're 0-3 in games in which I've bet on them this season. Absolutely brutal, which is a nice tie-in to our PointsBet daily bets. It is a busy, busy night in the NHL, so let's dig into it courtesy of PointsBet Canada, starting with matchup right there at the bottom, Florida versus Montreal, and I am going with the over here. It's paying real close to even money. It's set at 6.5. Florida on a road trip. They just had a high-scoring game against the Toronto Maple Leafs, losing 5-4 in overtime. Both expected goalies tonight in terms of Montembeault and Bobrovsky. They both have goals against averages of above 3, which means I think there's a pretty good chance we're getting 7 or more goals in this one. So I love that spot. And also going back to the old shot prop parlay. I like taking Kirby Dach to go over 1.5. He's hit this mark in 4 straight. And also, Colby talked about Matty Beniers. His line is only set at 1.5. He was on a 6-game run that just ended, so I like him to bounce back into the right column here. A couple of those parlayed at plus 147, and a quick final one. Nino Niederreiter has hit his shot prop in 7 out of 10, and it's paying plus 115. I'm all over that for my third play of the day, courtesy of PointsBet Canada. And Colby, I'm fascinated to get your take on what I want to hit on for garbage time. I see you rocking the Roger Federer lid. Love it. I am all in right now on the Breakpoint series on Netflix. And I know a lot of people were into Drive to Survive. I can't wait for the golf one that's coming out in like less than a month. And I think the NHL's got to take advantage of this. You see these sports that are growing massively because they're putting out documentaries and they're giving fans a real inside look into the sport, and not just current fans, but it's creating new fans because these things are done so well. And I think the NHL is making a huge mistake not having something like this for people to look at. And I'm not talking about some propaganda style thing that you put out on NHL.com that's just all fluff. I think fans of the game, and again, people who might not know enough about the NHL but are really intrigued by it, they'd be all in. There are some great characters and great stories in this sport. And I think it's a shame that it's not being told a little bit more in depth and a little bit more unfiltered.
Well, look, first off, I'm a huge tennis fan, so I'm dialed in every night to the Australian Open right now. So I'll be looking to see if you're giving any good prop bets on the Australian Open that I can pick off for you. But I haven't seen Point Break yet, but I have heard from everybody and anybody that they love it. Paul Stastny was texting me about it the other day because he's also a big Roger Federer and big tennis fan himself, but told me their whole team has been dialed in on it. And a lot of the guys, they're not tennis fans and they're not into it. So one thing my wife and I watch every year we look forward to is Hard Knocks on HBO for the NFL. And I'm with you. I think doing something with Netflix, putting it on a big platform, continually putting out content. I know, the Boston Bruins have done a nice job over the years with Behind the Bee. I think that gives a little bit of a look into behind the scenes, the locker room, the practice facility, where the just everything that goes into being an NHL player every day. The Blackhawks have one out right now called Next Shift. I also think that it's been really cool just to get Kyle Davidson, Norm McIver, Luke Richardson, Jonathan Taves. These guys are constantly sitting down doing interviews, really talking about what's happening day to day. So I am with you. I think that it's a fine line because you don't want it to be a propaganda vehicle, but ultimately show people what day-to-day life is like for these NHL players, because I think the general public has one idea, and I think that it might be sort of right, but I just think there's so many holes in there that people don't really understand or realize on what it is day to day. So I'm totally on board with that. I would love to see the NHL do something like that. And my wife just went out of town for a couple of days, so the next couple of nights will be all about binging Point Break and getting up to speed on it.
Love it. Quick wrap because we are out of time. But thanks to everyone who tuned in on Daily Faceoff on YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow with another show, and Frank Saravalli's got some insider news he's going to pass along as well. So we'll see you then. In the meantime, keep it locked on dailyfaceoff.com and enjoy a big night of NHL hockey.
Thanks for tuning in to Daily Faceoff Live. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to never miss an episode.